Hello, welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm David Foster. Members of the Syrian National Council have repeated that they will not be attending talks to try and find an end to the conflict. The council is part of the opposition's Syrian National Coalition. It says it's been offered no incentive by the Assad government to attend the international conference known as Geneva II. Well, the UN hopes to bring together all sides at the end of January. It will be the first such meeting since the conflict began. And as Al Jazeera's Anita McNaught reports from Istanbul, other parts of the National Coalition may also refuse to go to the talks.
The Syrian National Council, the largest opposition bloc within the Syrian National Coalition umbrella opposition group, was never keen on the idea of Geneva II. And a month ago, they put out a statement saying that they didn't think they would go. This meeting has been designed to reconsider that, to see if anything on the ground has changed. And the consensus is that it has not. There have been no conciliatory gestures from the Assad regime along the lines of releasing prisoners or alleviating the siege on some civilian areas, nor do they feel confident that the Western powers and the Middle Eastern powers, in fact, and powers like Russia are actually committed to the preconditions that these groups and the Syrian National Coalition as a body wanted to see enacted before Geneva II or during Geneva II's passage. That is to say, the commitment to a transitional government sweeping away the previous Assad regime. What effect is this going to happen on the Syrian National Coalition meeting, which comes off the back of the Syrian National Council meeting? Well, one delegate here described it to me as a domino effect. As the largest bloc, if they decide they can't go, this is going to have a hugely influential effect on the decision-making process at the Syrian National Coalition. And the end result, given that the Syrian National Coalition has to come up with a 2/3 vote in favour of going, may mean that this demonstrates that Geneva II participation by the Syrian opposition is not possible at all. Who is keen on Geneva II at this point? Well, we have some interesting dissenting voices here. Some we understand about. The Democratic bloc led by Michel Kilo, it's felt that those people would still be prepared to go to Geneva II if there was support for it. The Muslim Brotherhood have also showed flexibility, and in the negotiations in the Syrian National Council too, they have been perhaps the only voice saying that it would be possible to go with preconditions of their own, but perhaps not the same stringent preconditions that the other groups felt. The Kurdish groups are still prepared to go and sit round the table at Geneva II, and there are some leftist groups, some progressive groups, who also might be flexible. But do they have the numbers to take the Syrian opposition as a bloc there? At the moment, it doesn't appear that they do.
Well, that was Anita McNaught in Istanbul. Turning to developments on the ground in Syria, where rebel infighting's taken a new turn, with one Islamic group taking on another. The Islamic Front claims to have killed 16 fighters from the al-Qaeda-linked Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, known as ISIL. Local fighters and civilians in rebel-held territory have been growing increasingly unhappy with ISIL's influence, and protests against the group took place on Friday. There are reports that ISIL fired on these demonstrators in the town of Kafata Karim, that's in Idlib province, to break up the rally. The group has been criticised for increasing the violence and seizing journalists and workers and activists. And yet, adding to the confusion, the Islamic Front now says it's not actually against the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. Make of that what you will. Well, to discuss the latest developments in Syria, we're joined by our guest in Istanbul, Khaled Saleh, who's head of the media office of the opposition's Syrian National Coalition. In Washington, D.C., Hannah Allam, who's foreign affairs correspondent at McClatchy newspapers, and in Stockholm, Mohammad Bassam Imadi, a former member of the Syrian National Council, also the former Syrian ambassador to Sweden. Welcome to you all. Let's go to Washington, D.C. And Hannah, first of all, with so many divisions apparent within the Syrian National Coalition, within the opposition as a whole, what is the point of the SNC anymore?
Well, I think that's a great question, and that's one that's on the minds of everyone, certainly at the State Department, who are working on the Syria file. Here we are, fewer than 3 weeks out from this Geneva conference. We have no delegation, no solid commitment on attendance, And with all these divisions that we've seen, this sort of war within the civil war happening now with the uprising against one of the two Al-Qaeda affiliates on the ostensibly on the opposition side, on the rebel side, you know, there's really no way that there could be any sort of implementation.
Is it apparent what it tries to do? Is it apparent what it has achieved, what it has tried to do but hasn't been able to achieve? Do we know what it really is?
Certainly not to the Syrians I've spoken with. They wonder what's the point. They have, of course, derided it for a long time as an exiled group that's out of touch, with little sway over the events on the ground. And despite, you know, certainly there's some very hard workers and people who are working hard to change that, who have tried to administer the opposition-controlled territories, but they really have been stymied at every turn, either by internal fighting or, you know, the ongoing efforts, or, you know, the feeling of abandonment by the international community as well.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mohammad Imadi in Stockholm, former ambassador to Sweden, former member of the Syrian National Council. You decided in the end that it just wasn't working. You decided to get out of the council, which is part of the coalition. What was going so wrong, in your opinion?
First of all, what was wrong was that the SNC was established on the wrong basis. It was only, as your guest from Washington said, some expatriates who were living outside Syria. They lost touch with the reality in Syria. They didn't know what was going on. They had no connection with the people inside, and over that, they came and they thought that this revolution will end so quickly, like Egypt and Tunisia. So they were not really interested in establishing a real institutional organization that could work in cohesion with the people inside Syria. They thought that within a few months they will become presidents or ministers. So they were not interested in doing anything other than contacting the foreign powers and the countries around Syria, and they neglected totally the revolutionaries inside, the military, the civilian people inside, and above all, as I said, they could not work as a unit. At the end of the day, they lost everything. So when I stayed for about 6 months, from December until May, and then at the end of May I decided that this is not going to work, and all what I was doing was really meaningless because it was not being put in a channel that would lead to the benefit of the Syrian people. So I decided to leave.
I'm going to come back to you in a short while and ask you what you think the alternative is, and I'm going to go to Khaled Saleh. I've seen several ironic, I guess they're ironic, smiles on your face as we've listened to the other two guests. You are effectively the spin doctor for the Syrian National Coalition, and a spin doctor's job is to make their organisation sound worthwhile, to sound as though it's doing a good job. At the moment, you don't appear to have many fans, at least on this programme.
Well, let's look at the realities and let's leave propaganda aside for a little. I'm somebody who represents revolutionary groups, somebody who was actually in the political office of the Islamic Liberation Front, what's turned to be the Islamic Front right now. So perhaps a lot more connected to the ground than your other two guests, somebody who travels to Syria at least 1 week per month. The reality of it, there is a tremendous job that the SNC, the Syrian coalition, is expected to do. It's supposed to be an alternative government to the Assad regime, but there are a couple of things that happened. The Assad regime has systematically destroyed any efforts, any reputation that the Syrian coalition can do. It's also set the expectation of the Syrian people very high. The Assad regime did it in a very intelligent way. They told people, listen, you're asking for democracy, you're asking for freedom, and surely the world is going to come and save you, knowing very well that the world is not going to really act. The world has very complex.
But I'm going to jump in here because the two people on our programme who are criticising the work of the SNC don't appear to me to be people who would swallow the propaganda of the Assad regime. These are people outside, and they are saying that the SNC is pretty much useless.
Well, let's look at specifics. It's a lot easier to say, well, the SNC is useless, but look at specifics. The Syrian coalition is able right now to send about $25 million per month and organize the relief work inside of Syria. The Syrian coalition was able to get the Arab League seat for which was assigned to Syria. The Syrian coalition has been able to establish local administrative councils that actually, if you travel to Deir ez-Zor, for example, if you travel to the city of Aleppo, especially today that we're able to push ISIS out of Aleppo, you will see that the local councils are actually organizing things there. As a matter of fact, even if you travel only 25 kilometers away from the presidential palace, you will see the local councils and their work. If you travel to Daraa, this is actual work on the ground. Now, I must say that the task at hand is humongous, is magnificent, and we have very limited resources. All the money that the Syrian coalition has received right now since its formation is less than 70 million. The Syria needs right now on monthly basis about $750 million. Now,
okay, well, what we'll do is we'll get on to why you haven't got that sort of money in just a moment, and we will look at what you may consider to be some of the achievements. I think we're going to bring up a map which shows that since the beginning of the conflict in March of 2011, working out exactly what's happened on the ground in Syria. We know this as journalists, and you know that as well, has been extremely difficult. Each side giving its own version of events, but here's the latest update from your group, Khaled, the Syrian National Coalition. Al-Raqqa city in north-central Syria, apparently now completely in rebel hands. 84% of the city of Idlib, that's in northwestern Syria and bordering Turkey, currently with the rebels, is the claim. 82% of the city of Deir ez-Zor, I think it's the sixth largest city in Syria, alongside the Euphrates, bordering Iraq, apparently now under rebel control. And near Damascus, rebels said to have taken control of 80% of the countryside. 78% of Aleppo in rebel hands. That's the biggest city in Syria, now reportedly under rebel control. Do you consider that to be a pretty solid achievement after all this time and all these lives lost?
Well, I mean, like, we're actually in the map that you're looking at, and I can't see it, but we're talking about provinces, so we're not talking about specific cities. There has been a regime strategy where they decided to let go of some of these areas and some of the other areas. The FSA forces actually managed to move in and capture some of these areas. Now, if we had this program about a week ago, you'd have told me, well, ISIS managed to move in, ISIS is controlling all of these areas. However, what started happening since yesterday is that the FSA had revolted against ISIS, is able to push them out of Aleppo from all the
neighborhoods. Syria, I must remind our viewers, yeah, Islamic State
exactly.
in Syria.
So those are Al-Qaeda affiliated. We've managed to push them out of Aleppo, the city. There's only one other neighborhood that they control. We've managed now to capture all of their soldiers that they've had on the border crossing. So yes, the FSA had really paid a very expensive price for achievements. The real question is, so we're able to liberate these areas, but are we able to provide services? And that's the challenge. That's where the international community needs to step in and do something.
Okay, Hannah Allam. If, as it says, the Syrian National Council will not go to these talks in Geneva, we know that other groups are saying that they may well not go to the talks. That's if they happen at all in Geneva, which, strangely enough, are actually happening in Montreux rather than Geneva, but that's just a sidebar. If the Council doesn't go, it says it will pull out of the coalition if the coalition goes. Therefore, is the coalition doomed?
Right. Well, it would appear that at least the prospect for any sort of meaningful Geneva talks are doomed. And yes, I mean, we've already seen the disintegration of the military side, the so-called moderate rebel command, and now it appears we're seeing the same sort of internal divisions really working against the structure of what was the political opposition. So, and even if they were to pull together a delegation to send to the conference, it's really unclear what sort of sway they would have, what sort of authority they would have to implement any sort of agreement that comes out of it, given this focus now on the internal fighting, like I said, a war within the civil war that's it's not working against Assad, it's fighting among themselves, among this side that's ostensibly united in this fight against
Khaled, I'll come back to you in a little while. We must give Mohammad Imadi a chance here. He's been listening to what our other two guests have been saying. So let us suppose, Mohammed, that the Syrian National Council pulls out of the Syrian National Coalition. Therefore, the influence of the Syrian National Coalition has to be weaker than it was before. You've said you don't think the coalition is working. Therefore, what would you put in its place? How do you change it and further your aims?
Well, first of all, let me say something. I'm really sorry that Mr. Saleh put all the achievements of the rebels inside on the side of the coalition. It's not the work of the coalition that liberated all these places. Let me remind your viewers that almost all rebels inside denounced the coalition, and they also denounced the Syrian National Council, and they said they don't represent the rebels.
I'm going to pull you back to the question I asked. What's the alternative?
The alternative is the people inside. Now, we know that in Syria, inside Syria, there are groups that are uniting now, the military groups. I mean, the rebels which are fighting the regime. I'm not talking about Al-Qaeda, and I'm not talking about Daesh or Al-Nusra. I'm talking about other moderate Islamists, so to speak. Those have united, and only before yesterday, I think, there was a new unification between many groups fighting the regime. And I think at the end of the day, we will see many groups coming together, forming one unit against the regime. As soon as they get rid of all those infiltrators, which the regime planted in them, in order to have this war within a war, which was talking about by your guest from Washington. The alternative is from inside, the people who are fighting on the ground. She said correctly that if any agreement is reached in Geneva, who is going to implement it? People inside Syria don't recognize Geneva. They don't recognize the coalition. They don't recognize the SNC. Who is going to implement it? Let's say now the coalition reach an agreement. Forget about going or not going. Suppose there is an agreement between the coalition and others who attend in Geneva. Are they capable of implementing it? Let me tell you this, let me say, put it in another word. The majority of the members of the coalition cannot go into Syria. They will be condemned to death if they go there. They will be assassinated because they are seen as traitors. Because one of them, or at least you know, the leadership, are getting $10,000 a month, sitting in 5-star hotels, and the people of Syria are dying of hunger.
Well, okay, listen, I don't want to get into the financial arrangements at the moment, but I'll go to Khaled Saleh in a moment. I'll give you a chance to say that is or isn't the case, but I do want to ask you, Khaled Saleh, one particular thing you brought up was why are you not getting the money that you say you deserved? And that is because support amongst many of the countries that you were led to believe initially would actually back you to the hilt, such as the United States, is waning. And that is probably because the United States would rather see Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups defeated first and then possibly see the fall of the Assad regime, whereas what you guys want to do is defeat Assad and then go on, you say, to kick the extremists out of Syria. You have different aims. Long-term aim the same, but short-term aims different.
I would disagree with that. The U.S. aid to the Syrian revolution, to the Syrian people, has been slow coming all along, even before we had the problem with Al-Qaeda. And this is not a particular problem to Syria. I think you need to look at U.S. aid to other areas. So
okay, well, the statements of support are getting weaker and weaker, as well as the money not being there.
Yeah, I'm like, well, let's talk about the money and then we'll get into the statement of support. The money, 80 to 85% of U.S. support usually to any disaster-stricken area is going through the UN, and that's what the U.S. continues to do. It's a U.S. policy. It's been there for 70 years. They're not going to change it because of Syria. It's something that we've complained about, but it is what it is. So that's the money side. In terms of support, I mean, more than the strong statements coming out from John Kerry in the last 5 days, you know, a letter that he addressed to the Syrian coalition, I don't know what more we can be asking for. The statement that came out from Mr. Haig, Lauren Fabios, I mean, like everybody is issuing these statements. So let's look at the realities and what's taking place. That's number one. Number two, in terms of Geneva, everybody's focused, is the Syrian coalition is going to Geneva or not? The real question that everybody should be asking, well, is Geneva going to be successful or not? And that's the big question that we're putting in front of everybody. We believe that Geneva is about establishment of a transitional governing body, something that's going to replace Assad, a transitional governing body that's where Assad is going to hand over power to the Syrian people, to elected people. This is a major step. This is a marathon for the Assad regime. What we're telling the international community, if you're convinced that you can convince Assad to do that in Geneva, how about some baby steps? How about smaller steps? How about allowing food to enter into besieged areas that didn't have food for about 14 or 15 months? The international community fails to even do these small baby steps, yet they're trying to convince us that the Assad regime is, is going to be able to run a marathon. We don't think that's the case. So the ball's in the international community's court. They can do something in the next 10 days. In order for people in Mu'addamiyah to get food, they had to raise the Assad regime flag, and in return, they got 400 cans of food and I think about 20 or 25 bags of rice for 8,000 people. There's a complete failure on the part of the international community, yet there is still time.
And I assume that while these people aren't getting the money and the supplies they get, you're not getting the $10,000 that it was suggested you might be getting.
We're definitely, yeah. I think it's laughable to mention that there are people. I can say for myself, I don't get paid by the Syrian coalition. I used to make hundreds of thousands running a top marketing firm in the U.S. The same applies for many of the top leadership.
Okay, well, let us move on from that. I had to give you the right of reply. I want to bring in another element here. Just a few weeks ago, you probably saw the program. We had General Salim Idris, who's the Chief of Staff of the Free Syrian Army, on this program, and I asked him which now is the bigger enemy, the Islamist fighters in Iraq or the Assad regime. This is what he told me.
Frankly, the bigger enemy for the Syrian citizens is still the regime in Damascus, because when we collapse the regime in Damascus, all other groups will leave the country. I think they are coming. They came to support Bashar regime.
General, you say it'll be a long fight. Could it be many more years?
It could be. I am sorry to say it could be for many, many more years.
Well, I said, Hannah Allam, I asked him many more years, and he said many, many more years. And do you see any possible resolution?
Certainly, that's a view shared by policymakers here in Washington, analysts who monitor the conflict from afar as well as on the field. No, there's really no resolution in sight.
And therefore has the
United States has narrowed its interest to chemical weapons.
Yeah, therefore has the enthusiasm for Arab revolutions gone away at the State Department?
Well, they're certainly taking a more jaundiced look at them now. There's less of the rah-rah cheerleading element of them, such as when Ambassador Ford rode into Hama very, very early on in the uprising and pledged support, which I think was interpreted as that would translate into U.S. backing. And it became very quickly apparent that this administration, the Obama administration, had no interest in wading into this conflict. And, perhaps the more cynical of analysts would say that now they're happy to just talk about a Geneva process, and as a way of just saying, as long as that's going on, it really prevents them from being forced into any sort of deeper commitments.
I'm going to have to ask you to be pretty brief on this one. Is there any point in Geneva II?
I don't think so, but let me first say something.
No, I'm sorry, it's got to be quick. It's got to be quick, and you've got to stick to the question. Yes. Is there any point in anybody going?
I just want to tell you that the difference between the beginning of the Friends of Syria, the first conference, there were about 120 countries attending. Now the last conference was about 10 countries just sitting with the opposition. That is only a proof to show you the failure of the coalition in convincing the world that it is the right organization. Now to come back, and this is why
I've got to go to Khaled. I've got to go to Khaled.
Or not.
Time is an issue. Time is an issue. We do not have many minutes, let alone many years. Khaled Saleh, will the coalition be going to Geneva II?
The real question is Geneva II going to be successful? If this is going to be successful, we're going to be there tomorrow. The last Friends of Syria, by the way, seems Mr. Imadi doesn't follow the news very carefully. September 17th, 138 countries. So, let's just watch the news. But if Geneva is going to be successful, we're going to be there. We'll go to Geneva. We'll go to Rome. It doesn't matter to me.
And you wouldn't mind if the Iranians were there?
Giving Bashar more time to kill people. We're still talking about the Iranians, but if the Iranians want to be there, they need to do a few things. First, they need to agree to the principles of Geneva. They still reject them. They need to pull out their forces. And believe me, if they're going to be there, they're going to be sitting in the guilty seat. Iran is what kept this regime going for their own strategic interests. Iran is what's killed over 150,000 Syrians. They are as responsible as the Assad regime. So if they're going to be there, they're going to be questioned as much as the Assad regime is going to be questioned.
Listen, we thank you very much indeed. We know that there are no answers at the moment to any of the questions which I have posed, but thank you for kicking around just a few of the ideas. And thank you to my guests out of Istanbul. We had Khaled Saleh. In Washington, D.C., Hannah Allam, and in Stockholm, Mohammad Bassam Imadi. That is it for today. Thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what is happening inside Syria, not just on this programme, but with our hourly news programmes and online at aljazeera.com. Thank you for watching Inside Syria. I'm David Foster. From me and the rest of the team, goodbye for now.